It was a humid Miami night, one of those thick, restless evenings when even the palm trees seemed to hold their breath. At 11:43 p.m., a trembling 911 call shattered the quiet. A man's voice, raw with panic, gasped, "Someone broke in! There's blood everywhere!" Moments later, police would discover the unthinkable, a mother and two sons brutally stabbed to death, and a 10-year-old girl clinging to life. The caller was the husband, the father, Jacob Miller. At first, it looked like a random home invasion, but as detectives combed through the blood-spattered house, they began to see cracks in the story, missing signs of forced entry, valuables untouched, and a performance that felt rehearsed. Days later, that surviving child, lying in a hospital bed, whispered 4 words that would unravel the entire facade and shock a nation. "You stabbed me." This is the story of betrayal inside the perfect American family and how a little girl's courage shattered her father's deadly illusion. The night of June 18, 2021, began like any other in the quiet Miami suburb of Pinecrest Gardens, a peaceful pocket of manicured lawns, flickering porch lights, and the low hum of air conditioners battling the sticky summer air. Inside the Miller home, Sarah Miller was tucking in her youngest, 10-year-old Emma, after a bedtime story about dolphins, the child's favorite. In the next room, Timothy, 14, was finishing a school project on marine life, while 12-year-old Nathan had already drifted off to sleep, his soccer ball still resting at the foot of his bed. Jacob Miller, a 42-year-old long-haul truck driver, was supposedly in the garage working on his rig, according to what he'd later tell police. To the outside world, the Millers were a typical middle-class family living the American dream. 2 working parents, 3 bright kids, a modest home near good schools. But behind closed doors, subtle fractures had been spreading for months. Financial stress, mounting debt, and a father growing increasingly distant, unpredictable, and irritable. No one, least of all Sarah, could have imagined that within hours, their peaceful home would become a blood-soaked crime scene that would haunt Miami for years. At 11:43 p.m., a frantic 911 call pierced through the Miami-Dade dispatch lines. The caller, Jacob Miller, claimed his family had been attacked by an intruder. His voice shook as he pleaded, "There's blood everywhere! My wife, my kids, please, hurry!" Within minutes, patrol cars raced through the darkened streets, their red and blue lights flashing across the palm-lined cul-de-sac. When first responders arrived, they found Jacob outside the front door, covered in streaks of blood, a superficial cut on his arm, and eyes wide with shock, or what looked like it. "They're inside! Someone broke in!" he yelled, gesturing wildly toward the house. But as officers stepped through the threshold, the smell of iron and death hit them instantly. The scene inside was beyond comprehension. Sarah lay motionless in the master bedroom, her body bearing multiple stab wounds. Timothy and Nathan were found in their shared room, both lifeless, both attacked in their sleep. And then came the smallest, faintest sound, a low whimper from down the hall. In Emma's bedroom, barely clinging to life, the little girl was discovered on the floor, her small body soaked in blood, a pulse weak but still there. The medics rushed in, their voices overlapping as they called for backup, for trauma transport, for hope. Detectives arriving within the hour began processing what seemed at first glance to be a botched home invasion. Furniture was overturned, drawers pulled open, a lamp shattered. But the details didn't fit. Valuables sat untouched on the counters. Cell phones, laptops, a wedding ring. The back door Jacob claimed was kicked in showed no signs of forced entry. No windows were broken, no footprints led in or out. To a trained eye like Detective Zachary Holland's, something felt off. The chaos looked staged. Holland, a seasoned investigator with 15 years in homicide, noticed Jacob's unusual composure amid the carnage. He wasn't collapsed in grief beside his wife, nor frozen in disbelief near his son's bodies. Instead, he paced the kitchen, asking about what police had found, whether there were any leads, questions that seemed oddly procedural for a man who had just lost his family. Officers on the scene noted his glances toward the knife block on the counter. One knife missing, the rest neatly in place. Within minutes, that absence became crucial. A bloodied kitchen knife was later found discarded under a laundry basket, its handle bearing only Jacob's fingerprints. The first whisper of suspicion had arrived, quiet but undeniable. Meanwhile, paramedics fought to keep Emma alive as they rushed her to Miami Children's Hospital. Her survival would later be called nothing short of miraculous. In the ambulance, Jacob rode along, maintaining his role as the devastated father. Yet something strange caught the trauma nurse's attention. Emma refused to look at him. Despite her pain and fading consciousness, she turned her head away, trembling when he tried to hold her hand. At the time, the nurse assumed it was confusion or shock, but that reaction would later become the emotional pivot of the entire investigation. Back at the Miller home, as dawn crept over Miami, police tape fluttered in the humid breeze. Neighbors stood behind barricades in silence, staring at the home they had passed hundreds of times, the home that now held 3 bodies and a mystery. The morning sun illuminated the bloodied floors and overturned furniture, casting long shadows that stretched like ghosts across the crime scene. For the first responders, it was another night of horror in a city known for crime, but for Detective Holland, this case felt different. Something about Jacob's eyes told him the truth was far darker than a home invasion. And soon, as the evidence began to speak for itself, that feeling would prove devastatingly right. In the days following the murders, Miami's headlines painted the Millers as the embodiment of suburban normalcy, a picture-perfect family torn apart by senseless violence. To their neighbors on Banyan Drive, Jacob and Sarah were quiet but friendly, the type of couple who waved from their driveway and hosted small barbecues on long weekends. Sarah, 39, worked from home as a graphic designer, juggling freelance clients while keeping her kids' schedules running like clockwork. Her workspace, a bright sunlit corner of their living room, was filled with color swatches, client sketches, and little hand-drawn notes from her children taped along the edge of her computer monitor. She was the type of mom who remembered every teacher's birthday, who packed lunches with handwritten notes, and who volunteered at school art fairs. Jacob, on the other hand, was the family's provider, or at least that's how he wanted to be seen. A long-haul truck driver who was often away for days, he wore his exhaustion like a badge of sacrifice. He'd tell neighbors about the endless highways, the sleepless nights, and how he did it all for his kids. But underneath that weathered smile was a man sinking deeper into a web of debt, pride, and resentment that no one yet understood. The children, by every account, were the heart of the family. Timothy, the eldest at 14, had an old soul and a gentle curiosity about the world. His teachers described him as brilliant, a boy who devoured science books and dreamed of becoming a marine biologist. His bedroom reflected that passion. Shells lined up on his dresser, small notebooks filled with hand-drawn diagrams of ocean creatures, and a half-finished project about coral bleaching that still sat open on his desk the night he died. Nathan, 2 years younger, was all energy and laughter, a soccer player with an infectious grin who spent his weekends practicing tricks in the backyard. His sneakers scuffing the grass Sarah worked so hard to keep green. His friends said he could never stay mad, even when his team lost. He was the one who'd crack a joke to make everyone laugh again. And then there was Emma, their little dreamer. She adored drawing beside her mother, filling sketchbooks with imaginary animals and family portraits where everyone smiled. In every picture, her father's arms were drawn wide around them, a symbol of safety that would one day twist into unbearable irony. The Millers looked like a family on the rise, full of love, promise, and plans for the future. But in truth, their foundation was already cracking. Behind those warm family photos was a marriage quietly collapsing under financial strain. Jacob's trucking income had dwindled over the previous 2 years, while Sarah's freelance work was slowly becoming their main lifeline. Friends later told investigators that Sarah had confided worries about missing money and strange withdrawals from their joint account, but she never believed it could be anything sinister, just her husband struggling to manage stress. What she didn't know was that Jacob's nights on the road often ended not in motels, but in the neon haze of casino floors. He had accumulated over $150,000 in gambling debts to underground betting circles and local casinos operating just outside Miami's legal limits. And when those debts began closing in, his confidence and sanity started to crumble. Jacob had quietly taken out multiple life insurance policies on his wife and children in the months before the murders, each with increased payouts for accidental or violent deaths. On paper, he looked like a responsible father planning for the unexpected. In reality, he was building the scaffolding for his own deadly plan. As Sarah continued booking new design clients and excitedly planned a family trip to the Florida Keys, Jacob was searching online for how to stage a home invasion and life insurance payout after murder. To outsiders, the Millers' home was a place of comfort, a single-story house painted pale yellow with a white fence and a tire swing Jacob had installed years earlier for the kids. Neighbors remembered hearing laughter and music drifting from the backyard on warm evenings, unaware of the silence that had started to settle inside those walls. Sarah's sister would later recall one haunting phone call just a week before the murders, where Sarah admitted Jacob had been short-tempered lately, often coming home from trips in brooding silence or lashing out over small things like unpaid bills or forgotten groceries. Still, she had brushed it off. "He's just tired," she said. "He's under pressure." No one, least of all Sarah, realized how far his desperation had gone. On the morning of June 18th, hours before the murders, Sarah sent an email to her sister with the subject line, "Finally, some good news." She had landed a new client and attached a photo of Emma smiling beside her desk. It was a snapshot of a woman holding her family together through love and optimism. That same night, her husband would turn that home into a crime scene, extinguishing 3 lives in pursuit of money that would never be his to spend. And in the heart of Miami, a city built on sunlit dreams, one family's perfect image was about to collapse into one of the darkest tragedies the state had ever seen. When dawn broke over Miami the morning after the murders, the Miller home was already sealed behind yellow tape. The once cheerful house now stood in eerie silence, its lawns scattered with evidence markers glinting in the humid sunlight. Neighbors gathered in stunned clusters at the end of the cul-de-sac, clutching coffee cups and whispering through tears. Many had known Sarah from school events and community meetings. To them, Jacob was the quiet man who waved from his truck, always polite but distant. None of them could process the sight of investigators moving in and out of the home with cameras, gloves, and biohazard bags. Inside, Detective Zachary Holland, one of Miami-Dade's most seasoned homicide investigators, walked slowly from room to room, absorbing the story written in blood. Holland had seen hundreds of crime scenes in his 15 years on the force, but something about this one gnawed at him. The violence was too methodical, the chaos too precise. He noted that drawers were pulled out, but their contents neatly spilled onto the floor, jewelry and electronics untouched, and that the supposed signs of forced entry Jacob described were nowhere to be found. It didn't feel like a break-in. It felt like theater. Jacob Miller's interview began less than 6 hours after the murders in a quiet corner of the police station, with a cup of coffee trembling in his hands. To the untrained eye, he appeared shattered, a man barely holding himself together. But Holland had learned to listen between the words. When asked about the night's events, Jacob's story seemed rehearsed, the pauses too deliberate, the emotions too perfectly timed. He told detectives he'd been working in the garage on his truck when he heard a crash inside, then ran in to find an intruder fleeing through the back door. "I tried to fight him," he said. showing a small cut on his arm that the medical examiner would later identify as self-inflicted. He claimed his family was already dead when he found them. Holland nodded, let him talk, but noticed the same detail every good detective does. Jacob kept referring to the scene, not to my wife or my kids. It was as if he was describing someone else's tragedy. Meanwhile, officers quietly verified the neighborhood's security footage. None showed any unfamiliar person approaching or leaving the Miller home that night. The only vehicle seen arriving was Jacob's truck, 2 hours earlier than the time he claimed to have returned from work. That single discrepancy shifted the tone of the entire investigation. Back at the crime scene, forensic technicians were uncovering more inconsistencies. The blood spatter on the walls and floors told a story no lie could hide. The direction of the stains, the height of the cast-off patterns, the lack of defensive wounds on Jacob himself, all of it pointed inward. This wasn't a struggle, one analyst noted to Holland. This was an execution. Even the positioning of the bodies suggested order, not chaos. Sarah had been attacked first in the master bedroom. The boys were next, killed in their beds, showing little sign they had even woken up. And finally, Emma. She'd survived by what doctors would later call a miracle, her small body having lost more than half its blood volume before paramedics arrived. Detectives found the murder weapon, a kitchen knife from the family's own set, discarded in a laundry basket. Its handle bore only Jacob's fingerprints and Sarah's faint smudges from earlier in the day. It was the kind of evidence you can't explain away. Yet, when confronted with these details, Jacob remained eerily calm. He blamed the intruder, suggested he must have worn gloves, and even thanked the officers for doing their best. To Holland, that gratitude was telling. It wasn't the humility of an innocent man. It was the manipulation of someone trying to stay in control of a crumbling narrative. As the investigation deepened, so did Holland's suspicion that Jacob Miller was not the grieving father he pretended to be, but the orchestrator of one of Miami's most heinous domestic crimes. By the end of that first day, detectives had already gathered enough red flags to shift their focus inward. They learned Jacob had been home far earlier than he admitted, that his finances were collapsing under gambling debts, and that he'd recently taken out large insurance policies on his family. What sealed it, however, wasn't paperwork or blood. It was behavior. In the hours after the murders, Jacob made a series of phone calls, not to family or friends for emotional support, but to his insurance company. Surveillance footage from his hotel that night showed him pacing, not weeping. While the city mourned, Jacob Miller was planning. And though it would take days for the full truth to surface, Detective Holland already sensed it in his bones. This wasn't a man caught in tragedy. It was a man performing it. Soon, the story he built would collapse under the weight of a little girl's courage and the meticulous work of those who refused to believe his lies. At Miami Children's Hospital, the sterile brightness of the trauma bay became a silent battlefield where a little girl's life hung by a thread. Emma Miller arrived just after midnight, her body pale from blood loss, her breathing shallow and ragged. The paramedics had done everything right. Pressure dressings, oxygen, rapid transport, but the odds were stacked against her. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and abdomen, injuries that would have been fatal to most adults, let alone a 10-year-old. The trauma team moved with calm urgency, cutting away her blood-soaked pajamas as monitors filled the room with urgent beeps. Dr. Melissa Sandoval, the pediatric trauma surgeon on call that night, would later recall that Emma's survival bordered on the miraculous. "She shouldn't have made it," she told reporters months later, her voice breaking slightly. But she fought. Every breath, every heartbeat was a fight. While doctors worked to repair torn organs and stem internal bleeding, detectives stood just outside the glass doors, quietly realizing that this small, unconscious child might be the only living witness to one of the most chilling crimes Miami had ever seen. In the days that followed, Emma remained in critical condition, drifting in and out of consciousness under heavy sedation. Her grandparents flew in from Chicago, their faces etched with grief and disbelief, waiting outside the intensive care unit as police guarded the hallway. Jacob Miller, meanwhile, had been temporarily allowed to visit, at least at first. Nurses noted something strange during those early moments. When Jacob entered the room, Emma's vital signs spiked. Her heart rate jumped, her breathing quickened, and her small hand, still wrapped in IV tubing, trembled when he spoke. She never turned to face him, never called him Dad. At first, medical staff chalked it up to trauma or confusion, but Detective Holland, standing in the corner, didn't miss the way Emma's tiny body flinched when Jacob touched her arm. That instinctive recoil was more powerful than any fingerprint. When Jacob left, her numbers stabilized. It was as though her body knew what her mind wasn't ready to say, that the person she feared most wasn't the intruder her father described, but the man standing beside her bed. Within hours, Jacob's hospital visits were quietly restricted for investigative reasons. To the public, he was still the grieving father. To the detectives, he was quickly becoming their prime suspect. Over the next week, Emma's recovery was nothing short of astonishing. The surgeons called it resilience, the nurses called it grace, and Detective Holland called it hope. Each day she grew stronger, sitting up for a few minutes, then longer. She began speaking softly to her grandmother, asking questions about her mom and brothers, questions no one knew how to answer. "Are they in another room?" she whispered once, her voice small and trembling. Her grandmother could only nod, too broken to speak. With each passing day, the team at the hospital worked not just to heal Emma's body, but to protect her fragile mind. That's when Dr. Sophia Martinez, a child trauma psychiatrist, was brought in. Her role wasn't to interrogate, but to guide, to create a space where Emma could feel safe enough to remember. Dr. Martinez filled Emma's room with soft colors, therapy drawings, and even a golden retriever therapy dog named Luna, who rarely left her side. Slowly, through play and conversation, Emma began to recall fragments of that terrible night, sounds, shadows, and eventually, a face. She spoke of hearing her mom scream, of her father's voice yelling, of feeling sharp pain before everything went black. The truth was beginning to surface, not in statements but in the tremor of a child's memories finding their way through fear. One evening, as twilight spilled through the hospital windows, Emma drew a picture that would change the course of the investigation. In it, her family stood together, but her father's face was blank. When Dr. Martinez gently asked why, Emma hesitated, then whispered, "Because he was scary that night." Her eyes filled with tears as she added, "Daddy said I have to say it was a bad man, or else I'll be in trouble too." That moment, the fragile honesty of a wounded child, was captured in Dr. Martinez's notes and later presented to prosecutors. It confirmed what Detective Holland had suspected since that first night. Emma had seen everything. She wasn't just a victim, she was the truth. As she healed, the investigation around her accelerated. Forensic evidence was mounting, Jacob's lies were unraveling, and the little girl who was never supposed to survive had become the key to justice. Her scars would never fade completely, but her courage had already begun to pierce through the darkness her father created. And as Miami watched the case unfold, one thing became painfully clear. Emma Miller's survival wasn't just a medical miracle, it was a moral one. By the second week after the murders, the Miller case had shifted from tragedy to suspicion. What began as a supposed home invasion was now quietly unraveling under the scrutiny of seasoned detectives and forensic experts. The more investigators examined Jacob's version of events, the more it fell apart. He claimed he had arrived home late from a trucking route, but GPS data from his rig told a different story. It had been parked near the Miller residence hours earlier than he admitted. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station even showed him buying bleach and garbage bags just after 8 p.m. that night. The receipts were found later, stuffed in the pocket of a jacket in his garage. To Detective Holland, it was no longer a matter of if Jacob was involved, but why. Still, the team knew suspicion wasn't enough. They needed irrefutable proof, evidence that could withstand a defense team and a courtroom. So, they followed every thread: the financial records, the insurance policies, the deleted text messages. Bit by bit, Jacob's carefully constructed alibi began to crumble like paper under rain. The financial investigation revealed the motive that stitched the entire case together. In the 6 months leading up to the murders, Jacob had taken out 3 separate life insurance policies, one for Sarah and one for each of the children. The combined payout totaled nearly $1.2 million. Each policy had been filed with different agents, under slightly varied addresses, an effort that suggested premeditation. Even more chilling, Jacob had called the insurance provider the day before the murders to confirm coverage in case of accidental loss. That same night, he purchased the knife later confirmed as the murder weapon, though he would claim it was simply part of a new kitchen set. Forensic technicians discovered Jacob's fingerprints not only on the blade, but on the packaging it came in, hidden under a tarp in the garage. In one of his darker ironies, Jacob had even searched online for how long insurance takes to pay after death, just 48 hours before the killings. Every digital trace betrayed him, every timestamp pulled back another layer of deceit. To the detectives, it was becoming clear that Jacob's crime wasn't one of rage, it was one of calculation. Meanwhile, Emma's recovery, and the fragments of memory she shared, were strengthening the prosecution's case. Dr. Martinez continued her sessions with the child, documenting every word with clinical precision. During one quiet afternoon, Emma described the sound of her father's voice that night, low, angry, telling her to stay still as he leaned over her. That statement, paired with forensic data showing blood spatter on the inside of Jacob's shirt, was the turning point. Holland ordered a full reanalysis of the clothing Jacob had been wearing when he made the 911 call. Under luminol, the truth glowed blue. Blood patterns consistent with close contact stabbing covered his torso, including areas that could not have been contaminated by simply finding the victims. It was the smoking gun. When Holland confronted him during a second interrogation, Jacob's composure began to fracture. He leaned back in his chair, muttered about stress, about things getting out of hand, and at one point whispered, "I didn't mean for her to wake up." The room went silent. It wasn't a confession in full, but it was enough. The mask was slipping, and the man who once played the role of heartbroken father now looked like what he truly was, a murderer cornered by his own lies. As news of the investigation leaked, public opinion turned sharply. The community that once rallied behind Jacob began to see the truth in the details, the cold calculations, the insurance motive, the fake tears. Vigils for Sarah and the children filled the streets, candles flickering beneath framed photographs of smiling faces that would never grow older. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, and the case that had begun as a home invasion horror became one of Florida's most shocking domestic tragedies. Inside the station, Detective Holland watched the final pieces fall into place with a heavy heart. He'd seen plenty of killers try to outsmart the system, but few had weaponized fatherhood itself. The lie that Jacob built had collapsed entirely. And yet, there was still one more piece to secure: the testimony of the only surviving witness. Emma, still healing and fragile, would soon be asked to do the unimaginable, to tell the world what her father had done. It was a burden no child should bear, but one she would carry with quiet strength, because in the end, truth doesn't fade under pressure. It only burns brighter. The world watched as Emma Miller, the only surviving witness of the Miller murders, began the slow, painful process of speaking about what happened that night. In the weeks after her recovery, child psychiatrist Dr. Sophia Martinez continued her therapy sessions under the supervision of both medical staff and detectives. Emma had regained enough strength to walk short distances, her small frame wrapped in a soft pink hoodie, her left arm still bandaged. Every step she took down those sterile hospital hallways was a quiet act of courage. The sessions began gently, drawing, coloring, and storytelling through play therapy. Emma often drew her mother holding her hand or her brothers laughing beside her. But one afternoon, as the crayons rolled across the table, she paused and said softly, "Mommy was scared that night." Dr. Martinez leaned in, asking, "Do you remember why?" Emma's lower lip trembled before she whispered, "Daddy was mad." That small sentence cracked the case wide open. It was the first time she had linked Jacob to the night of the killings. The little girl who had survived the unthinkable was now giving voice to the truth everyone feared and needed to hear. Detectives knew Emma's memories were delicate, and they couldn't afford to push too hard. The process had to be ethical, patient, and humane. Over several sessions, Emma pieced together fragments of the night. The sound of footsteps in the hallway, her mother's scream, and the moment her bedroom door opened. She described seeing her father's shadow in the doorway, holding something shiny. "I thought he was protecting us," she said through tears. But he looked different. His eyes looked angry. Those simple, haunting words became the emotional center of the prosecution's case. Detective Holland attended every session from behind a one-way mirror, his face often tight with contained emotion. He'd seen hardened criminals break under interrogation, but watching a child find the courage to speak truth against her own father was unlike anything he'd experienced. With every word Emma remembered, the fog of that night lifted a little more. Soon her recollections were backed by forensic evidence. Jacob's fingerprints on the knife, his timeline discrepancies, his internet searches. Emma's truth wasn't just emotional, it was factual, and together those two forms of evidence, heart and science, became the unstoppable force that would bring Jacob to justice. When the time came for Emma's statement to be formally recorded, a team of specialists prepared her carefully. She was placed in a child-friendly interview room, a small space painted in warm colors, with stuffed animals and soft lighting. Detective Holland sat quietly in the corner, letting Dr. Martinez take the lead. The recording began with gentle questions about her favorite memories, then slowly shifted toward that night. "Do you remember what Daddy said when he came into your room?" Dr. Martinez asked softly. Emma nodded, her eyes fixed on the small camera. "He said, 'Don't move,'" she whispered. "Then he hurt me. I told him, 'You stabbed me.' And he said I was dreaming." Her voice was calm, almost detached, but the impact was seismic. That one sentence, "You stabbed me," would echo across courtrooms, newsrooms, and public consciousness for months to come. It was the line that turned a mystery into a confession, that transformed a crime story into a human tragedy. When the recording ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Holland stepped outside, exhaled hard, and muttered under his breath, "That little girl just did what grown men couldn't. She brought down a killer." The prosecution now had what they needed. Emma's recorded testimony, combined with the forensic trail and Jacob's financial motives, formed a case so airtight it could cut through steel. But beyond the evidence was something even more powerful, the emotional truth of a child's voice. Emma's courage resonated far beyond Miami. Media outlets picked up her story, not just as another headline, but as a symbol of resilience. Donations poured in for her recovery. Letters of support arrived from strangers across the country, some from parents, others from survivors of domestic abuse, who saw in Emma's story a reflection of their own silent battles. Meanwhile, Jacob sat in a holding cell, his face blank, refusing to speak to investigators. The man who once controlled his family's every move now had no control left. His silence, once a weapon, had become his prison. And though Emma was still learning to sleep without nightmares, her bravery had already rewritten the narrative. She was no longer the girl who barely survived. She was the girl who spoke the truth when the world needed it most. The arrest of Jacob Miller came on a gray, humid morning that seemed to hang heavy over Miami. After weeks of surveillance, gathering final warrants, and coordinating with the state attorney's office, Detective Holland's team made their move. Jacob was staying in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place with buzzing fluorescent lights and fading wallpaper. He had been under quiet observation since the night Emma's recorded testimony was filed. Investigators had noticed he wasn't grieving, he was planning. He'd made calls to a private attorney, attempted to move funds through a friend's account, and even looked up how to flee to South America without a passport. It was enough to confirm their fears that he might try to run. When officers surrounded the motel, Jacob opened the door half asleep, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and an expression that was more annoyance than shock. "What's this about?" he asked, voice flat, eyes hollow. The officers read him his rights as Holland stepped forward, saying only 6 words that hung in the air like a verdict. "We know what you did, Jacob." The man who once called 911 to report his family's murder was now being led away in handcuffs for committing it. News of Jacob's arrest broke within hours, sending shockwaves through Miami and beyond. Television stations interrupted programming with the headline, "Father Arrested in Triple Family Murder." The same neighbors who had once brought him casseroles and comfort now stood in stunned silence as footage of his arrest played on repeat. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, microphones flashing as prosecutors confirmed the charges. 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Inside the interrogation room, Jacob sat across from Detective Holland, a man he had underestimated from the start. Holland placed a stack of photos on the table, crime scene images, forensic results, Emma's drawings. Then, without a word, he pressed play on the recording of Emma's voice. "You stabbed me." The words filled the sterile room like a haunting echo. Jacob's jaw tightened. His composure wavered for the first time. "She doesn't know what she's saying," he muttered. But Holland leaned in, eyes steady. "She knows exactly what she's saying. You told her it was a dream. She remembered anyway." The silence that followed was heavier than any confession. For the first time, Jacob looked afraid, not of prison, but of the truth he could no longer bury. Over the next 6 hours, Jacob oscillated between denial and self-pity. He blamed stress, debt, even a blackout. He claimed he didn't remember parts of that night, that something in him snapped. But detectives had seen it before. This was no blackout. It was a man cornered by his own greed. As evidence was laid out piece by piece, his phone's GPS logs, the bleach purchase, the insurance policies, the fingerprinted knife, Jacob's defenses eroded. Finally, around 3 a.m., he slumped forward, his hands trembling. "I didn't mean for her to see me," he said softly. "She wasn't supposed to wake up." It wasn't the full confession the prosecution wanted, but it was enough to destroy his defense. Holland sat in silence for a long moment before responding. "You killed them for money, Jacob. But what you'll never understand is that the one thing you couldn't buy, couldn't lie about, couldn't bury, was your daughter's courage." Jacob looked up, his face drained of defiance. For the first time, he realized that the little girl he had tried to silence had become the voice that sealed his fate. When Jacob Miller was officially charged, the community that once pitied him now saw him for what he truly was, a man who traded love for greed, family for profit, and his soul for a lie. His mugshot, with its cold, empty stare, flooded every news outlet in Florida. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered holding candles for Sarah, Timothy, Nathan, and Emma. Some carried signs that read, "Justice for the Millers." Others simply prayed. Emma, still recovering in the hospital, wasn't told the full details of her father's arrest right away. Her grandparents shielded her, saying only that Daddy wouldn't be coming home again. In the quiet of her hospital room, she stared at the window for a long time, then whispered to her grandmother, "I told the truth." And she had. The case against Jacob was no longer a mystery or a tragedy. It was a testament to truth overcoming evil. Detective Holland, watching the news that night, didn't feel triumph. He felt something closer to sorrow. But in that sorrow, there was peace. Because in a city that had witnessed countless crimes, this case had become something more, a story of innocence surviving the darkest betrayal, and of justice born from the voice of a child who refused to stay silent. The trial of Jacob Miller began almost a year after the murders, yet for Miami it felt as though no time had passed at all. Television vans crowded the courthouse square, their satellite dishes glinting under the Florida sun. Spectators lined up hours early to claim a seat in the gallery. Everyone wanted to see the man whose face had become the city's darkest headline. Inside, prosecutors moved with quiet precision. They opened not with theatrics, but with a single photograph of the Miller family before the killings, 5 smiling faces frozen in happier days. "This," the prosecutor said softly, "is what he destroyed." The jury, 12 ordinary citizens, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Across the room sat Jacob, dressed in a suit that hung loose on his frame, staring at the table, expression unreadable. Behind him, armed deputies stood watch, while Detective Holland took a seat near the front, hands clasped, prepared to watch the final act of a case that had consumed his every waking hour. The prosecution built its narrative layer by layer, letting the facts speak louder than emotion. Forensic experts detailed the blood patterns, the knives matching serrations, the GPS logs from Jacob's truck. A digital forensics analyst projected Jacob's search history onto a large screen, each search date corresponding exactly with the steps of his plan. The jurors leaned forward as phrases like, "how to fake a break-in," and "how soon does insurance pay after death" appeared in stark white letters. Then came the financial documents, policy applications, payment receipts, and bank transfers that showed how Jacob had gambled his family's future away. When Detective Holland took the stand, his testimony was steady but human. He described finding Emma's small body still breathing, the silence of that house, and the moment he realized the killer wasn't outside, it was inside. The courtroom stayed silent except for the scratch of pens. Holland's words carried the weight of every night he'd spent piecing the puzzle together, and when he stepped down, the jurors looked shaken, as if they'd glimpsed the scene themselves. But the trial's emotional center came on the 3rd week, when prosecutors played Emma's recorded statement. The lights dimmed, and the jury watched the video of a little girl sitting beside a stuffed animal, her voice soft but unwavering. "Daddy said don't move. Then he hurt me." A collective breath left the room. Some jurors wiped their eyes, even court staff turned away. The defense objected, calling it prejudicial, but the judge overruled. Her words were evidence, not sentiment. The defense then tried to paint Jacob as mentally unstable, a man under financial and emotional strain who snapped. They brought in psychologists, character witnesses, even hinted at childhood trauma. Yet nothing could wash away the methodical preparation revealed by the evidence. Jacob himself took the stand, against his lawyer's advice. He cried, claimed confusion, and said he woke up covered in blood. But under cross-examination, when asked why he called the insurance company before calling relatives, he froze. The silence lasted almost 30 seconds. In that pause, the jury heard more truth than any confession could provide. After 4 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. Outside, hundreds waited in hushed anticipation as storm clouds gathered above the courthouse. It took just 5 hours. When the jurors filed back in, not one met Jacob's eyes. "On the charge of first-degree murder," the foreperson read, "we find the defendant guilty." The same verdict followed for each count and finally, guilty of attempted murder for the attack on Emma. Jacob's shoulders sagged. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, but he didn't respond. In the gallery, Sarah's sister sobbed quietly, while Detective Holland stared straight ahead, expression unreadable. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp as thunder, sealing the fate of the man who had once called himself a father. Outside, as rain began to fall on the courthouse steps, reporters shouted questions no one wanted to answer. Inside, a sense of stillness settled, a grim, heavy peace. Justice, long delayed, had finally spoken. When the guilty verdict echoed through the courtroom, it felt as if the air itself shifted. For nearly a year, the city of Miami had lived with the question of whether justice would ever reach the man who had destroyed his own family. Now, at last, that question was answered. Jacob Miller sat motionless as the words rang out, but around him the courtroom trembled with emotion. Muffled sobs, a single shout of relief from the back row, the sound of people exhaling a year's worth of pain. Reporters darted from the room to announce the news, their voices breaking through live broadcasts within minutes. Guilty on all counts. Outside, thunder rolled over the courthouse dome, a sound that many later said felt like punctuation. Inside, the judge thanked the jury for its service, then set a date for sentencing. But for Sarah Miller's family, the verdict was only half a victory. Justice, they knew, could not restore what had been lost. Yet in that moment, it gave them something they had lived without for months, peace that the truth had finally prevailed. Sentencing day arrived 6 weeks later. The courtroom was smaller this time, quieter, but every seat was filled. Jacob entered in shackles, escorted by deputies, his once neat hair now graying at the edges. Prosecutors asked for the maximum penalty, life without parole, citing not just the brutality of the crime, but the coldness of its planning. When given a chance to speak, Jacob read from a piece of paper, his voice low and flat. He blamed gambling, depression, a lapse of reason, and ended by saying, "I loved my family." No one in the room believed it. When it was Sarah's sister's turn to speak, she faced him directly. "You loved yourself," she said. "You left us with ashes and a child who still wakes up screaming." Emma, too young to attend in person, had written a letter that her grandmother read aloud. "I miss Mommy and my brothers," it said, "but I am not afraid of you anymore." By the time the judge pronounced the sentence, 3 consecutive life terms plus 40 years, the room was silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Jacob was led away without looking back. The aftermath stretched far beyond the courtroom. In the weeks following the sentencing, a memorial service was held at the park where Sarah used to bring her children to play. Hundreds attended, many of them strangers who had followed the case since the beginning. Candles flickered around framed photographs, Sarah laughing under palm trees, Timothy holding a seashell, Nathan grinning in his soccer uniform, Emma in a hospital gown drawing with crayons. The service wasn't about vengeance, it was about reclaiming humanity from horror. Speakers talked about the warning signs of domestic violence and the importance of mental health outreach, turning tragedy into a public call for awareness. Detective Holland attended quietly at the back, his badge tucked into his pocket. For him, closure never came easy. Yet as he watched Emma release 3 white balloons into the evening sky, one for each life lost, he finally felt the weight begin to lift. The investigation had ended, but the story of resilience was just beginning. In the months that followed, Emma moved to Illinois with her grandparents, starting a new life surrounded by cousins, therapists, and a dog she named Hope. She attended a new school under a different last name, her scars hidden beneath bright clothes and a shy smile. Though nightmares lingered, her spirit slowly rekindled. The community continued to send letters, artwork, and small donations to support her future. Local news outlets ran follow-up pieces about the Miami Miracle Girl, focusing not on the crime, but on her recovery. Detective Holland visited once, at her grandparents' request. He brought her a small seashell from the Florida coast and told her it had belonged to her brother's collection. She held it tight and said, "Thank you for listening to me." He smiled. "You did the hard part," he replied. For Holland, for the city, and for everyone who had followed the case, Emma's quiet courage became the true verdict, the proof that even in the darkest stories, the light of truth can still find its way home. The months after the trial were not a clean slate for Emma Miller. They were a slow rebuilding. In the quiet Illinois suburb where she now lived with her grandparents, life moved at a gentler rhythm. There were still nights when she woke gasping, the old fear pressing at her chest. But the difference now was that someone always came when she called. Her grandmother would sit at the edge of her bed, brushing hair from her face, whispering, "You're safe, baby. You're safe." Therapy sessions filled the afternoons, and for the first time, Emma began to talk about her family in the past tense without breaking down. Her therapist taught her grounding exercises, naming colors in the room, feeling her heartbeat, reminding herself that nightmares are not reality. Healing, she learned, wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning how to live with what you remember. Each small victory, a full night's sleep, a day without tears, was a triumph no less real than the court's verdict. At school, Emma was the quiet new girl, known only to a few teachers for what she had survived. Her classmates never mentioned the story. Most didn't know it. She kept to herself at first, sketching in the margins of her notebooks, sunsets, dolphins, her mother's smile remembered from old photos. Over time, she found friends through art club, kids who didn't ask questions but shared crayons and laughter. That laughter was her bridge back to normal life. On weekends, she volunteered at a local animal shelter, walking dogs and learning to care for creatures who, like her, had known fear but trusted again anyway. Her grandparents watched her change with a kind of reverent disbelief. "She's finding her light," her grandfather said once, standing by the window as she played outside. What no one saw were the moments alone in her room when she whispered goodnight to the framed picture of her family. It was her way of keeping them near without being trapped by grief. The media eventually moved on, but the story never fully disappeared. Documentaries were made, podcasts recorded, each trying to make sense of the unthinkable. When one production team asked for her participation years later, Emma declined politely. "I don't want to be the girl from that house anymore," she said. "I just want to be me." And so she built a life beyond headlines. She took swimming lessons, learned the guitar, and started a small charity drive for children affected by domestic violence, calling it the Lantern Project. Each donation funded art supplies for young survivors, a way for them to tell their stories through color instead of pain. The first time she spoke publicly was at a local fundraiser when she was 16. Standing at the microphone, voice steady, she said, "You can lose everything and still find yourself again." The crowd rose in quiet applause, and somewhere in the audience, Detective Holland, retired now but still following her journey, smiled through tears. Years later, when Emma graduated high school, the ceremony was held outdoors under a clear June sky. Her grandparents sat in the front row holding hands. As she walked across the stage in her cap and gown, the wind caught her hair, and for a moment she looked almost weightless, as if the shadows had finally released her. She planned to study psychology, to help children who'd been through what she once endured. In her valedictory essay, which the principal read aloud, she wrote, "The world can break you, but it can also build you again if you let the right people in." Those words weren't about tragedy. They were about survival, love, and the quiet heroes who listen when no one else will. The girl who once whispered, "You stabbed me," was no longer a victim in a hospital bed. She was a young woman stepping into the sunlight, carrying both her pain and her strength, proving that even from the darkest night, a life can rise again.